All right, guys, we're gonna get started. Jerry. All right, so day 3. Today we're gonna start off with market failures. So market failures occur when competitive markets do not produce the socially optimal results, and they arise due to externalities or the breakdown of private property. Externalities are basically side effects or consequences of an activity that are not accounted for by the market. So an example would be bees and the surrounding crops, because the value of the crops aren't accounted in the beekeeper's costs or benefits, but it does help the surrounding farmers because bees help pollinate flowers. So in this example, it will be a positive externality. A negative externality will be like a paper factory in a nearby city, because the paper factory doesn't have any incentive to lower or prevent the pollution that it creates. So the effects of externalities. Positive externalities, if they are accounted for, will shift demand up. In the example we talked about previously, right? The people that are affected by the bees from the beekeepers, they will also have the demand for the beekeepers' bees. And negative externalities, when accounted for, will shift supply upwards. Because in our previous example, if the paper factory has to reduce its pollution, it will have to acquire more costs to lower the levels of pollution. And responses to externality. There are 3 responses that we use to help solve the issues of externality. And the first of these is internalization. Basically, you incorporate the activities that create the externality into one company. So for example, a farmer can both have his crops and maybe like a bee farm. That way you combine both activities into one company. You can also set up private property rights, and this is known as the Coase theorem. Basically, if you have set up private property rights, both parties can come to negotiate and end the externality. And lastly, if the other ones don't work, you have government intervention through taxes, quotas, or subsidies. All right, so types of goods. Before we talk about the types of goods, there are 2 different types of factors that we use to classify goods. The first of these is rivalry, and basically it's one's consumption of the good leaves less for others to consume. And the second is excludability, the ability to exclude someone from getting that good. So the types of goods that we will examine here today would be public goods, collective goods, common goods, and private goods. So let's start with public goods. Public goods are characterized with low or no excludability and low or no rivalry. They're usually provided by the government, and if they're not, they're usually supported by advertisements or private donations. Usually when they're not supported by the government, they are undersupplied. And examples of public goods are knowledge, research and development, radio broadcasts, and law enforcement. Second type of good we're going to talk about are collective goods. Collective goods are characterized with low rivalry and high excludability. These goods are typically natural monopolies, so usually the government regulates these markets. And examples of these are satellite radio, pay-per-view television, and so forth. And now we talk about common goods. Common goods have low excludability but high rivalry. And these goods often suffer from tragedy of the commons, in which the resources are overused because no one has ownership of them. We will talk about tragedy of the commons in a few slides later. And some examples of common goods are fish in the ocean and your freeways when they're starting to get congested. And finally, we reach private goods. Private goods have both high rivalry and high excludability. Examples of these goods are like ice cream, laptops, and masks. A lot of the stuff that you buy from the supermarket generally are private goods. So yeah. And now tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons occurs when there's an overuse in a resource because as stated earlier, no one owns the resource. So everyone just uses it and doesn't take into account for the negative externalities that they exert onto that resource. And usually they occur on goods that are common or public because usually those are not privately owned. And so to solve this issue, you either establish property rights or you have the government step in. Institutions, organizations, and governments. Institutions are basically formal and informal rules that we as a society follow by. Most of our markets are types of institutions. Other types of institutions are like marriage or tipping waiters. Organizations are different than institutions in that they are formal rules and structures that shape our society. So some of these would be like commodity and stock exchanges, and some religions are types of organizations. The limitations for institutions and organizations is that they require voluntary cooperation. So if you choose not to follow an institution or an organization, that is completely fine. And now we talk about the government. The government is special because the government has the legal monopoly on the use of force. So that includes catching criminals, using the military, imposing price controls on markets, regulating monopolies, and so forth. They help enforce voluntary corporations through the court system where they enforce contracts. And government help resolve market failures and restore long-run economic equilibrium through fiscal and monetary policy. We'll get that probably tomorrow or next week. And government failures and inefficiencies. Because government officials are also people, sometimes they abuse their powers to get more for themselves. And so the USAID identifies 3 types of government corruptions and inefficiencies. The first of these is pork barrel politics. And this basically occurs when elected officials introduce projects that bring money to their districts. Um, I mean, on the surface, it looks pretty good because first it gains the elected officials more popularity, but also brings money to their district. But the issue is on the national level because pork barrel politics increases government expenditures unnecessarily. The second of these inefficiencies are log rolling, where elected officials basically kind of like vote trade. So I vote for your project, you vote for mine. And log rolling is the factor behind why pork barrel politics works in the first place, because elected officials toss their votes for each other. And lastly, we have rent seekings. Rent seeking is when when the public has to pay for one or a small group of people to benefit. And examples of these in the market right now are like price support for domestic sugar industries or welfare programs. And now we reach section 3, macroeconomics. So the first thing in macroeconomics we're going to talk about is the gross domestic product, GDP. The gross domestic product is the measure of the production of final goods and services in a country within a specified time period. And this was developed around the Great Depression by Simon Kuznets. Some limitations of GDP is that sometimes goods and services are hard to determine if they're a final good or intermediate good. For example, national defense. You can argue that national defense is a final service, but other people argue that's an intermediate because by having a national defense, you don't have to go out and buy weapons and stuff to defend your own home. The government already provides that for you. So, you can use that money now to buy on other things you want to do. So yeah. The second limitation of GDP is that it does not account for unpaid work. So household chores and all are not accounted. So when in the past, when women started entering the workforce, our GDP increased, but that does not mean our productivity has actually increased. It just means that we've shifted from unpaid labor to paid labor. And a third limitation is that GDP does not account for externalities. So it does not account for pollution or the other things that deplete and destroy our environment. And one final limitation is that GDP cannot measure happiness because higher production does not mean um, more happiness. Using GDP as a measure of expenditures. So in theory, that everything that you produce has to be bought. So therefore, GDP can be thought of something as measuring the national expenditure. And we can see this on the circular flow model, which I will show and talk about tomorrow. There are four actors in the economies that contribute to expenditure. There are households, firms, government, and the foreign sector. And so GDP basically consists of consumption, which is the spending done by households, investment, which is spending on capital equipment by businesses and firms. Investments also include inventories or business inventories and the purchases of houses by residents. Next, you have government spending. Basically, government spending on goods and services are counted here. Payments such as Social Security does not count in government spending because they do not increase productivity. And finally, you have net exports, or basically exports minus imports, and that's where the foreign sector comes into play. Yeah. And finally, we can also use GDP as a measure of national income because everything that is bought is revenue for firms, and firms spend this revenue on as wages and to buy equipment. And eventually, all the money in theory will come back to households. So we can use GDP as a measure of national income. And I have the formula here for measuring national income as using GDP. You wouldn't need to memorize this for ACADEC Econ, but I've just put it there because we learned it for AP Macro. And now we're going to talk about real and nominal GDP. So the real GDP is the GDP taking account of inflation. So this allows us to compare the true change in production because we're using the same prices from a base year. Yeah, the value of real GDP uses the current year quantities and the base year's prices. And the base year is not really a specific year. You just, for a specific problem, they'll tell you. Like, for example, 2005 is the base year, calculate the real GDP. Anytime in economics you see the word real, it means that the value is calculated with the removal of inflation. And nominal GDP is the value of GDP in the current year, and that includes inflation. So whenever, usually when you see on like Google or somewhere on the news, if they talk about GDP, usually it will mean nominal GDP, where they use current prices and current production to find the value. Yeah, so again, anytime in economics you see the word nominal, it means the value is calculated with inflation. And using GDP deflator to measure inflation. GDP deflator is basically dividing nominal by, or nominal divided by real, and you multiply that by 100. It gives you an index. So if you see that the index is over 100, you would expect that between year A and year B, there has been some sort of inflation. And to calculate inflation, you would use the nominal No, sorry, it should say GDP deflator of year A, subtract GDP deflator of year B, divided by GDP deflator by year B. Um, and usually sometimes if they only give you two, especially if they only give you 2 years, one of the nominal GDPs, or sorry, the GDP deflator for one of them will be 1 because you're using the same number divided by itself. And so to find rates of change in economics, a helpful formula is to use the one shown below. Final value, subtracting initial value, and dividing it by the initial value. Now we talk about CPI. CPI is the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of a basket of goods that the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures monthly. The BLS updates this market basket every 2 years. And so CPI, to calculate CPI, you find the market basket in the current year and divide it by the price of the market basket in your base year, and you multiply that by 100. And so similarly, inflation, you would use CPI of year A, subtract CPI of year B, divide all that by CPI of year B. When calculating CPI, be aware that your quantity of goods doesn't change when you calculate your CPI for year B or year A, because the goal of CPI is to measure the price change. And the reason why CPI is important is because Social Security and other benefit payments follow closely. They watch CPI closely to adjust their pay rates to match inflation. And so some weaknesses of CPI, you have unmeasured quality change, because sometimes an increase in a goods product in the goods price does not mean there's inflation. It could mean there's quality change, right? For example, if you look at the iPhone, you compare the one from the early 2000s to the ones now. Definitely, the ones now are much more expensive, but all of that price increase did not come from inflation itself. It also comes from improvements in the quality of the iPhone, right? You have better cameras, you have larger screens, etc. Substitution bias. Substitution bias basically states as the prices of one good increases, households will find a way to buy more of the substitutes. Remember that the BLS only updates the market basket every 2 years. So when the good inside the basket has a higher price, it does not mean people still buy as much of that good as before. People will switch to the cheaper substitute. But CPI does not account for that until the BLS updates its market basket. And new goods and services. Because again, CPI does not measure everything, every good in the economy. It means that new goods that quickly have high market penetration wouldn't show up first in the CPI. It would only show up after it's reached the market penetration and after the BLS updates its market basket. So sometimes an increase in your CPI doesn't necessarily mean there's inflation. It might just mean there's a new good that's popular in the economy and is a little bit more expensive. And so in 1996, the Boston Commission basically looked into CPI and concluded that each year, CPI overstates inflation by 1.3%. And now we talk about GDP deflator versus CPI. Generally, both tell you the same thing. When there's inflation, both GDP deflator and CPI would rise. However, CPI rises much more than GDP deflator. And this is due to reasons such as CPI measuring a smaller amount of goods and services, because again, it's a market basket. CPI is also influenced by exports, such as oil. So if you look at the graph for CPI and GDP deflator during the 70s, CPI rose much more than GDP deflator because OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, actually placed a limit on oil exports during those years. So CPI actually rose up much higher because most of our oil is imported from there. So yeah, CPI tends to be a little bit more volatile than GDP deflator. And that's the end of day 3. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or suggestions? Yes, Ruben? The first 3 slides. This one? Supply goes up because, right, if you look at the paper factory, when you're here, right, the factory doesn't do anything to limit its pollution. But once, like society or the government makes the paper factory reduce its pollution, it has to increase its cost to reduce that pollution, so you shift it upwards. Yeah. Yep. Anyone else have any questions? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Beverly Hills, you guys got any questions? No? Alrighty. All right. Anyone on Zoom have any questions? All right, then I guess that'll be all for today. Everyone on Zoom, y'all have a great day and we'll see you tomorrow. You guys may leave the meeting.